The Mississippi River, the longest river in North America, cuts through the deep south of the United States and commands both its heart and soul. High above the river, on protecting bluffs, sits the small town of Natchez, Mississippi. Full of history, Natchez attracts visitors from all over the world who are interested in its almost museum-like preservation of antebellum homes and structures. Though the central portion of town was laid out in the 1790s by the Spanish, the town of Natchez has lived under the flags of 5 different nations, each contributing its own ethic and style.
From King's Tavern, the earliest surviving building in town.
The house on Ellicott's Hill, where the American flag was first raised in the Mississippi Territory.
Dixie, a fine town residence begun in 1853.
The Griffith McComas House, a portion of which may date as early as the late 1790s.
Tejada, the first brick building in Natchez.
Glen Auburn, a massive Victorian home recently owned by the actor George Hamilton.
Rosalie, adjacent to Fort Rosalie, the focal point for the first Europeans in the lower Mississippi.
The Briars, where Jefferson Davis was married.
Weymouth Hall, built in 1855, having one of the most commanding views of the Mississippi.
The Wigwam, said to be built on an old Indian burial site.
Stanton Hall, a full city block of opulence and grandeur.
Many historic homes in Natchez are available for viewing throughout the year, and tickets to visit most of them are available from pilgrimage headquarters. During special twice-yearly pilgrimage seasons, more than 30 homes are open to receive guests. Visitors can pick and choose from a variety of packages, each of which includes different homes. Arrangements to visit homes not on pilgrimage are made directly with the owners of the homes themselves by the tourist.
Travel to each of the houses in a pilgrimage package is by the visitor's own car or by package bus tours. Horse-drawn carriages or city bus tours are also available. The drivers are knowledgeable tour guides who provide interesting and informative details about each of their stops. Here, a group of tourists alight at Magnolia Hall, one of Natchez's great downtown homes.
Welcome to Magnolia Hall. This house was built in 1858 by Thomas Henderson. It's a red brick house that was stuccoed and squared to make it a pure brownstone. He built this house to be a modern house for his own destiny.
At the Burn, visitors have a chance to tour one of the earliest examples of purely Greek Revival homes in Natchez.
It sits above a pier table. Pier is the architectural term for the space between 2 windows. And keep the key cut.
Those lamps on the mantel are organ lamps, and they burned whale oil, and they were done in New York.
The table on the other side of the bed is a mid-Victorian sewing table.
Wonderful homes. But how did this all come about?
In May of 1539, Hernando de Soto landed in Tampa Bay. With 600 men and women in tow, along with many horses, other animals, and provisions, de Soto began an expedition ostensibly to colonize Florida and much of the area north of it. In truth, de Soto was searching for the fabled lost cities of gold. Needless to say, he never found them. It must have been a torturous trip in those days. Tropical and semi-tropical growth to chop through. Hazardous waters filled with poisonous snakes and alligators to avoid. Thick overgrowth, constantly in one's face, to be held back or cut through. And of course, always changeable weather, with heat and oppressive humidity in the summer and biting wet cold in the winter. 2 years later, DeSoto arrived some 200 miles north of what would later become Natchez and started to head south. He died before he made it to the Natchez area. But the terror his expedition created among the Indians of the regions, and even worse, the diseases his men brought, caused a decline of almost 80% of the native population before the arrival of the next expedition of Europeans 130 years later. Yet, what did DeSoto find? He found a land blessed with tremendous potential, extremely fertile soil, with peaceful verdant hills and countrysides to till and build upon. DeSoto also found a tremendous river for commerce and travel, the mighty Mississippi. Other than a brief exploration of the northern portion of the Mississippi by Canadian French searching for trade routes to the south, no other Europeans visited the area until 1682. That year, a Canadian expedition led by René Robert Cavalier, Sieur de La Salle, reached the Natchez area and then moved south to the Mississippi Delta, claiming all lands and tributaries of the Mississippi for France. It was he who named the territory Louisiana in honor of his king. By 1714, a trading post was established on the banks of the Mississippi in the area now called Natchez under the Hill. 2 years later, a fort was built just above these bluffs, overlooking the river. Its name, Fort Rosalie, in honor of the wife of the Minister of Marine, Le Comte de Pontchartrain. The seed for what was to become the city of Natchez was now planted. In the 80 years that followed the founding of Fort Rosalie, mapmakers of the area showed a constant progression of the fort's shape and the disposition of homes, farms, and businesses around it. Much of the change shown by these maps might be attributable to the fact that as time went on, the English booted out the French, and then the Spanish did the same to the English. Each new regime probably had its own ideas about what was a good defensive structure. When the English were running the show, the Crown gave out land grants to various citizens, urging them to occupy the area and build a new economy. It was the British governor of the West Florida Territory who willed that a town be laid out in what today is called Natchez under the Hill, that area below the bluffs of today's Natchez. This map shows the area around 1796. What's important to note here is that the town was well in place by the time this map was drawn, as was Natchez under the Hill, the earlier settlement of the two. The fort had probably achieved its final form by this time. Looking at the buildings of Natchez under the Hill today hardly gives a notion of the size or activity of the area in its heyday. These photographs were taken over 100 years ago. before the Mississippi River claimed much of the land upon which Natchez under the Hill stood. The town itself, a hodgepodge of businesses servicing the river traffic, saloons and dens of iniquity servicing whoever came in on the boats, restaurants providing an evening's meal, and homes for those sturdy souls who like living in a place that probably never went to sleep at night. Yet, everything looks pretty tranquil here. Today, Natchez under the Hill is a lot quieter than it once was. But it's up on top of those bluffs that we must turn our attention to next, because it's there that was built one of the wonderful homes of Natchez proper, right next to where once stood Fort Rosalie, the birthplace of Natchez.
Built in the early 1820s and first occupied in 1823, the brick mansion Rosalie was the dream home of Peter and Eliza Little. Rosalie is a federal-style mansion believed to have been designed by Baltimore architect James Griffith. The house was built just north of Fort Rosalie and was named after it. Peter Little lived in Rosalie until his death in 1856, his wife having predeceased him. The house was put up for sale by the estate, and the Andrew Wilson family purchased it in 1858. In the summer of 1863, and for the duration of the Civil War, Rosalie was used as federal headquarters by the Union, Natchez having surrendered in 1862. After the war, the Wilsons continued to live in the house. We're in the Central Hall. The halls were used for ventilation and also for sitting and reading. This is a beautiful plaster ceiling medallion just above the hall's central chandelier. The brass chandelier came from a riverboat that once plied the Mississippi. In those days, riverboats were like floating palaces, and the owners would update them or replace their fixtures as fashion changed, or start all over if the boats were grounded. Though this chandelier originally burned kerosene, it was electrified in 1912. Rosalie sits overlooking the mighty Mississippi. A wonderful view of the river can be seen from this landing on the hall stairs. At the foot of the stairs is a very fine grandfather clock. It was Peter Little's. He brought it here when he first moved in, though it dates from about 1810. Made by David Reveley in Philadelphia, it continues to keep good time. The library was used to write letters or to read a book. It was a good place to go and have a quiet cup of tea after dinner. Most of the pieces of furniture in the library belonged to the Wilsons, the second family to own Rosalie. This painting is of Sir William Dunbar, a friend of Peter Little's. Dunbar was an inventor, a scientist, and a cotton planter. The secretary below the portrait belonged to Dunbar. It is a late 1700s American Hepplewhite piece, cherry with maple inlay. Other pieces in the room are Victorian and Empire. The central table is a walnut Queen Anne table. The chocolate pot is a beautiful old Havilland pattern. Above the fireplace is a picture of Peter Little. He married when he was 25 years old and lived in this house until his death at the age of 75. This beautiful secretary is Victorian mahogany. On its shelves are books that belong to the Wilson family. The dining room is in the back west part of the house. The mirror and the pieces on the mantel came from a riverboat auction. The silver service is by Reed and Barton and dates from about 1840. This set is one of their earliest, dating from about the time Reed and Barton started making silver services. On the table is old Paris china. Each piece of the old Paris was hand-painted, therefore no two pieces are alike. The beautiful urn is from Scotland. It dates about 1760 and is the oldest piece at Rosalie. This is a cherry server, or étagère, made in Natchez from local wood. It is stocked with old Paris china. The portrait above the sideboard is that of Patricia Walton Shelby, first National President General of the Daughters of the American Revolution from Mississippi. She held the position from 1980 to 1983. Divided parlors are common in most of the historic homes in Natchez. Their use may have been separated by gender, the gentlemen in front with their brandy and cigars, and the ladies in the back with tea and delicate music. Just across the hall from the dining room is the rear parlor. This little French Pleyel piano was purchased by the Wilsons in 1849. Their daughter played it and the nearby harp. Both instruments came from London. Throughout this and the adjoining parlor, we see pieces of Belter furniture. The Belter parlor sets at Rosalie have become so famous with scholars and collectors that Belter pieces of the same design are referred to as having the Rosalie pattern. The beautiful Italian marble fireplaces with coal-burning inserts were put in about 1840 by Peter Little. The large French mirrors and vases were placed in the house in 1858 by the Wilson family. During the Civil War, the mirrors were removed from the house and stored. Not until all hostilities were ended were they returned to Rosalie. The carpet that you see is a copy of the original Brussels rug put in the house in 1858. Copied by Scalamandre for the Daughters of the American Revolution, the 2-year project was completed in the fall of 1989. Crystal chandeliers in both parlors are French. This Chickering piano dates to the late 1880s. It was one of the first 88-note pianos made and has excellent tone. We are heading into the front parlor. Many pieces of the famous Belter furniture can be seen. Grand piano in the right corner was donated to Rosalie. It dates between 1820 and 1840. It is rosewood with mother-of-pearl inlay made by Weiss of Baltimore. the drapes are gold leaf wooden cornices. The plaster crown molding matches the chandelier center medallions of both parlors. Rosalie is owned by the Mississippi State Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. They purchased it as a preservation project and share it with the public. Rosalie is open daily.
500 years before the coming of the white man, Indians recognized the promise of the lower Mississippi Valley and settled in. They created an agrarian mound-building society whose main crops included corn, beans, squash, melons, nuts, and the cultivation of many other naturally occurring foods. Here's St. Catherine's Creek, just a mile or so inland from the Mississippi River, and the center of the present-day city of Natchez. A number of villages sprang up, housing what today is called the tribe of the Natchez Indians, the last of a much larger group of Indians comprising the Mississippian culture. The grand village of the Natchez was the most important of the tribe's villages. It was here that the chief called the Great Sun lived. From the doorway of his house, built on the central mound, he would awaken the sun, and with a great wave of his hand, show it the direction to travel each day. Thus, everyday life in the grand village began. Looking at the remains of the abandoned mound today, little can be said of what its original use might have been. In this field, and at a number of other nearby sites, stood thatched roof houses which provided cold weather shelter for the ordinary members of the tribe. This reconstruction of a typical Natchez Indian's home is built according to notes and sketches made during the time of the early French explorations to the region. Constructed of mud and thatching over a frame structure, these homes attested to the high level of domestication of the Natchez. The small structure left of this Natchez home is a granary for the storage of corn. The point of having the granary raised was to protect its contents from mice or insects. Immediately to the left of the granary is a small raised roof structure used for hot weather shade from the sun. We are looking from the reconstructed home towards the chief's mound. The large plazas on either side of this mound were used for ceremonial purposes. This drawing of the chief's home was made early in the 1700s, though the surrounding paving and steps are not shown. This home of royalty was certainly on a grander and more impressive scale than those of mere commoners. At the far end of the ceremonial plaza area is the mound for the tribe's temple. In the temple, a perpetual flame was kept to symbolize the great sun and his predecessors. Death came swiftly to a priest who might accidentally let the flame die out. The Natchez lived by a 13-month lunar calendar. The Indians called their months after animals or crops which might have been in season during each of those months. This drawing and others to follow are by Antoine Lepage du Prats, a Frenchman who lived with the Natchez in the 1720s. Here he depicts the chief, or great sun, being transported to a feast by his eldest warriors. Prepared for the winter chill, the Natchez man is shown dressed in a deerskin shirt and moccasins. During hot weather, the men wore only a deerskin breechcloth. No matter what the season, the women and young girls of the Natchez wore skirts of animal hide and protective footwear. During wintertime, they might add a warm shirt. The harvest dance was a prelude to a very much ritualized courtship process between the eligible younger people of the tribe. Suffice it to say, the French missionaries to the Natchez were scandalized by what they saw. Save for an occasional foray against an enemy tribe and human sacrifice practiced at the time of a noble's death, life must have been fairly idyllic for the average Natchez. Blessed with plentiful food and game, and a highly developed sense of community and social pride, the early explorers paint a picture of Natchez life which, in many respects, was quite elegant in its simplicity. In addition to being good farmers, the Natchez also produced pottery for their own use and for trade with neighboring tribes. Hand-shaped stone and deer antler tools helped the Natchez do their daily tasks. When a Natchez died, he was buried with his worldly goods and implements. Clay pots and jewelry were buried with this skeleton. So, what happened to the Natchez? The final days began in 1729, when, in an effort to regain their land and drive the Europeans out, the Natchez attacked Fort Rosalie. The next year, the French mounted an expedition to end the Indian menace. Early in 1730, they attacked the Natchez against overwhelming force. The Natchez, as a tribe, was scattered to the wind.
Legend says that this home was built upon a Natchez Indian burial ground. Whether or not the story is true, it has been the rationale for why the house has been called the Wigwam. Burial ground or not, the house itself is a delight. There is some contention regarding when the earliest part of the house was built. Some people date it to 1790, while others say it was built as late as 1836. In any case, the house started as a little cottage, 4 rooms up and 4 rooms down. Today, it is 5,600 square feet. A considerable enlargement to Wigwam occurred in the late 1850s, when it became the home of Mr. and Mrs. Douglas Rivers. Mrs. Rivers was the former Eliza Little, adopted daughter of Peter and Eliza Little, owners of Rosalie. The 1850s remodeling gave Wigwam the Italianate look we see today. The inviting entry door is flanked by narrow windows, which set the tone for the verticality of the rooms to come. One of the things which immediately impresses the visitor to the Wigwam is the abundance of fancy molding. The moldings were put in during the remodeling to establish the elegant feel of the home and to call attention to the height of the ceilings, 14 feet up. Most of the moldings and friezes are made from plaster, though some are of wood. Notice the arches over the doors. These heavily fluted designs are executed in wood. The little Dauphin, a bisque figure, is from France, dating to the mid-1800s. The staircase is called a flying staircase and was installed in the house during the remodel. This elaborate ceiling medallion is made of plaster. The chandelier is French and dates to the mid-1800s. The couch on the left is American Empire style. There are many American Empire pieces throughout the house. This side table is a French Bombay chest. The portrait is of Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt, First Lady of the United States during the years 1901 to 1909. It was done by an American artist. The mirror you see came from Paris and was made in 1840. It's called a pier mirror and goes almost to the floor. At the bottom there is a little table with a marble top. The vase on the tabletop is Limoges. It dates from the mid-1800s and is signed. In the ladies' parlor, the chandelier is French Regency. The mate to it hangs in the gentleman's parlor. The furnishings in this room are French in feeling. The chairs are Louis XV. The center table is from New Orleans and is attributed to Prudent Millard. Though the couch is new, the tapestry pillows on it aren't. They're French and date to about 1840. This bust is of Marie Antoinette. The portrait is of four sisters by an unknown American artist. It was probably painted in New Orleans. The damask drapes are not original, but are of the period. As you look into the gentleman's parlor, you can see that the rooms are divided by folding doors. Pocket doors had not been invented at the time this portion of the house was built. This is the ballroom. The original painted ceiling of this room is certainly the most distinctive decorative feature to be found in Wigwam. The room today is a music room, but when it was built, it was used for fancy dress balls. It was added during the 1850s remodeling. The marble mantel is the only French mantel in Wigwam and dates to the turn of the century. The mantel is finely detailed with sculpted berries, leaves, and ribbons. The corners of the mantel are decorated with acanthus leaves, a decorative motif found in many homes in Natchez. On the mantel are old Paris porcelains. Old Paris was very popular in the South. It was one of two very famous manufacturers of porcelains imported to the United States from France in the mid-1800s. The other was Sèvres. The windows in the ballroom are magnificent and stretch from floor to ceiling. The mirror is contemporaneous with construction of the ballroom and came from France. It has hung here since the room was built. The mirror is tilted so that visitors can easily see the ceiling reflected in it. This French parlor suite contains 11 pieces. It has its original petit-point upholstery over horsehair stuffing. A portrait of a beautiful lady. The picture is English, but the artist is unknown. This is one of 2 little English countrysides. It is painted oil on canvas with gilt frame dating to the mid-1800s. This is the other English countryside. Across the room, we find a pink Sèvres porcelain. Its delicate coloration gives it a very ethereal feeling. This plate is set in a bronze frame with attached candlestick holders. Beneath the Sèvres is another French bisque bust sitting on a dolphin table. This table is called an English side table, and sitting on it is a liquor cabinet. The liquor cabinet provided a host easy access to refreshments for his guests. The table is mahogany with bronze decorations. The top is marble. In the formal dining room, the chandelier is of the period, dating from 1830. The chairs are English Chippendale, dating approximately 1780. The fan motif above this door is said to have influenced the architect of the remodeling to incorporate arches throughout the house. This mirror is from France and dates from approximately 1840. The candlesticks are also French and are from the Rococo period. The fireplace mantel is Italian. You are looking at a French panel mirror. The bottom is a mirror, and the top is this oil painting. The chairs that you see came from New Orleans. They date to 1880 and are wicker. The rug is Persian. The Wigwam is independently owned and operated as a bed and breakfast. The general public is welcome to visit. Tours can be easily arranged by calling the Wigwam.
Natchez today is a delightfully compact town with a clearly defined downtown, and just outside of that, an interesting mix of shops and homes, filtering further out to purely residential areas. It may come as a surprise to some that in its boom years of 1800 to 1860, Natchez had more millionaires within its borders than all of the rest of the country put together, save New York City. With all that money available, it was probably natural that homes would be built to last and shops would be sturdily constructed. The men and women who built Natchez were conservative types, who above all else wanted to preserve capital and the way of life that produced it. It's no wonder then that as talk of war between the states sprang up in the late 1850s, many of the important families of Natchez did not support it. They knew that in such a war, between an economy which was almost purely agrarian versus one which was totally industrial, the industrialized side would surely win. And Natchez money came from the land. City fathers had little option but to surrender promptly when the Union first arrived in May of 1862. More than anything else, The surrender of Natchez served to save from destruction the vast number of antebellum homes and commercial buildings that have survived to this day. The central plan for the city, laid out by the Spanish commandant of Fort Rosalie in the early 1790s, was based on a grid. The streets shown here, with north on the left and west on the bottom, allowed a total of 20 blocks of mixed-use town that grew and grew. In less than 90 years, Natchez grew into a mature city. In the late 1800s, a local photographer, Henry C. Norman, captured Natchez with a keen eye. This was Main Street looking west. Heading north, Union Street, with Firehouse Number 7, the Methodist Church, a hotel, and a school. This was looking down State Street toward the southwest. The roof with a belfry in the lower right is that of a firehouse. Shooting northwest, Norman photographed the old marketplace and City Hall. Looking eastward, Norman easily got a good shot of St. Mary's Cathedral, the oldest cathedral in Mississippi. Down at street level, Norman photographed his own studio and the stores on the first floor beneath it. A bookstore, a drugstore, a dentist's office. Were these men waiting to get their teeth pulled? Norman photographed the store across the street from his studio. Some might call it a hardware store, but it really sold supplies for interior decoration. Over on the north side of Main, between Commerce and Pearl Streets, men stood around the doors to J.C. Schwartz's hardware store. At the intersection of Union and Franklin Streets, all sorts of delights were available to the ladies of Natchez. Mr. Beekman's store, oddly out of place in this block, was basically a volume supplier in provisions to plantations. These gents, standing in front of Pollocks and Masons, probably handled supplies for the proprietor's booming business in cotton gins, presses, and wagons. F.A. Dick's was more an emporium of earthly delights than a drugstore. On Commerce Street, between Franklin and Main, A&M Moses sold buggies, wagons, and horses. Jacobs did a mini version of Sears Roebuck, selling anything and everything, plus copious quantities of spirits. The Cheesians always liked their toddy. The boys here obviously enjoyed having a good time. More than 100 years later, much is still here. Old St. Mary's bell tower still booms out noon every day. Many of the old commercial buildings are still with us, but the items more likely to be sold now are antiques and alfalfa and bean sprout sandwiches. New buildings mix with old. The charm still comes through. All the things you need for living, and then some. Everyday necessities, and some trivialities. Natchez is a town very similar to every other small town in America. But we all know Natchez is not just any town.
City block bounded by High Street on the south, Monroe on the north, Commerce on the east, and Pearl on the west, very close to the absolute center of downtown Natchez, Mr. Frederick Stanton and his wife Huldah decided to build a home, the likes of which would top anything anyone else had already done or might ever do. An Irishman, Mr. Stanton, had come to America in 1815 from Belfast. He quickly established a successful cotton brokerage in Natchez and rode the expanding cotton market throughout the years leading up to the Civil War. At the peak of his wealth in the 1850s, he owned more than 400 slaves and had over 15,000 acres of land divided between 6 plantations. In spite of this, he was not the wealthiest man in town. But this was not to deter him from building the grandest of all homes in Natchez. Completed in 1857, Stanton Hall is the work of architect Thomas Rose. Though there are 5 floors to Stanton Hall, we will confine ourselves to the first floor in this program. The main hallway of Stanton Hall is 72 feet long, 16 feet wide, and the ceilings are nearly 17 feet high. Looking down the main hall from just inside the front door, one is immediately struck by the immense scale of the building. Just above the sideboard on the right hang portraits of Mr. and Mrs. Stanton. Mr. Stanton was not the only representative of the Stanton family in the area. Other family members owned large plantations and townhouses in Mississippi and Louisiana. In addition, he was kin, by marriage, to other prominent families of the Natchez district. Huldah Laura Helms Stanton was from Versailles, Kentucky, and was married to Frederick Stanton in 1827. Together, they had 10 children. She lived in this house until 1893. Beneath the portraits is a delightful marble-top side table with crystal lamps. On the opposite wall to our immediate left is a French pier table holding 2 beautiful cut crystal urns. Stanton Hall contains 2 prominent decorative arches. The incorporation of the hallway arch was probably to soften the effect of the long space and to provide additional opportunity for decoration. The home is filled with beautiful moldings and cornice work. Repeating motifs of flowers, fruit, and acanthus leaves abound. This door leads from the hall to the library and displays ornamentation typical of that throughout the rest of the house. The library is dominated by a gilded French mirror, appropriate to the scale of the house. Over the years, the mirroring has become hazy, but because the mirror is cemented to the wall, the resilvering of it has been deemed impossible. This gasolier medallion is typical of other medallions throughout the house. Gasoliers throughout Stanton Hall have been hailed as possibly the finest of their kind ever executed. In the far corner can be seen one of the 2 globes in this room. This one shows celestial markings, and this terrestrial. The mantelpieces in Stanton Hall were executed in the finest Carrara marble and carved in New York City. located on the northwest side of the building. The room itself is 35 feet long and can easily seat more than 20 for a full-course meal. 2 white marble fireplaces warm the room, but are of much simpler design than found in other areas of the home. To the left, as the visitor enters the room, is an enormous breakfront containing nearly 200 pieces of hand-painted old Paris china. The decoration of each is unique. Throughout the room, one is struck by the scale and elegance of the place. The sideboard is Sheraton and displays 2 old Paris urns. This painting was a gift to Stanton Hall by Lady Godsworth of England. All of the silver is Sheffield, with the exception of the very ornate Boston coin silver water kettle in the right foreground, which dates to 1850. This sideboard is Empire design and descended in the Stanton family. The painting is of Adelina Patti, a famous 19th century soprano. Delightful candlestick holders sit atop the right fireplace. This curious box is a wine chest, lined with metal to contain iced wine bottles. Across the hall from the dining room are the amazing parlors for which Stanton Hall is justly famous. A beautiful ceiling medallion highlights yet another magnificent gasolier. The second of the grand French mirrors sets the tone for this room. The rug is a fine Aubusson. The double music stand in the left corner is from 1830. To our extreme left is a most unusual china cabinet. Made from cypress, the cabinet was put together from scraps of leftover hand-carved decorative moldings used elsewhere in the house. Decoration on the Carrara fireplace mantel found in this room and the adjoining parlors is the most elaborate to be found anywhere within the house. the rosewood and mahogany Empire pianoforte dates between 1810 and 1820. Stanton Hall is unusual in that the front parlor or ballroom is visually intersected by an arch to produce the effect of two rooms. The doors you see divide these front parlors from the back parlor. When open, the combined rooms present a ballroom of over 70 feet in length. The south wall of the ballroom supports the third grand mirror at Stanton Hall. Though made at the same time as the other mirrors, this one has not hazed. Like the archway in the main hall, the arch in the ballroom or front parlors of Stanton Hall is to add decorative relief to the vast scale of the rooms. The decorative moldings of the arch and ceiling continue classical designs found elsewhere in the house. This delightful etagere displays some of the interesting porcelains found at Stanton Hall. And over in this niche is the spot where years ago musicians provided the accompaniment for the great fetes and dances held in these rooms. After the death of Mrs. Stanton, the home went through a number of owners and uses. It was purchased in 1938 by the Pilgrimage Garden Club, restored to its former glory, and is available to the public for tours throughout the year. Stanton Hall, another fine home of Natchez, Mississippi.